These three lenses are some of my most used lenses on my Sony mirrorless cameras, and they're also pretty unique as well. So without further ado, here are three must-have lenses for your Sony mirrorless camera. Alright, so I'm going to start this off with probably the most unique lens on this list, as well as one of my favorites. So this lens really needs no introduction. This is the Helios 44-2. So this is a 58mm f2 lens from, I believe, the 1980s. And as you can see right here, this is an absolutely tiny lens. Now I have mine adapted to PL mount, and I also have a focus gear on here. But without these modifications that I have on mine, it would be an even smaller lens. Now like I said, this started production back in the 1980s, and you cannot buy this lens new now. You can only pick this up used on places like eBay or Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, or even some used camera shops might have a couple of copies of this. But you're not going to be able to buy this on like B&H Photo or Amazon or Best Buy or anything like that. Which also means this is a fully manual lens. There's no electronic contacts, there's no autofocus, no automatic aperture or anything like that. However, the images you can get with this lens are absolutely mind-blowing. There's just something special about the look this lens produces. It's not tack sharp, but it struggles with chromatic aberration and a little bit of ghosting and bad flaring and all sorts of other little issues. However, they do not ruin the images at all. They actually give them a bunch of texture. All the photos taken with this really have a unique vintage look, but it's also surprisingly sharp for being a lens that you can find for well under $100. Now I did say it's not tack sharp, but it is much sharper than other lenses in this price point. But that's not the thing you buy this lens for. You buy this for the unique look and just the amazing images that you can get out of it, which as you've probably seen by now, you 100% can. However, if you're looking for a super clean, tack sharp looking lens, that has autofocus and it's gonna get you just great photos, you can just point it up and shoot and take amazing photos with it, this is not the lens for you. You're gonna have to manually focus every time and change the aperture to get your correct exposure and take your time more than you would with a regular 50mm autofocus, super sharp, Sony G Master lens or something like that. But that is pretty much all there is to say about this lens. It is an absolutely amazing lens to use, and it's honestly one of my favorites just because of how fun it is and the crazy images you can get out of it. Actually, one last thing I forgot to mention, one of the big selling points of this lens is the swirly bokeh you can get. With certain subjects and certain distances away, you can just see the background almost swirling around the subject, and it looks absolutely phenomenal. But either way, let's move on to lens number 2. Alright, so this is probably the least unique lens, however, my most used lens on this list. So this is the Viltrox 35mm f1.8. Now this lens is not a vintage lens, so this has autofocus, it's a native E-mount lens for your Sony camera, it has electronic aperture, autofocus, and really fast autofocus at that. This lens is tack sharp, even wide open at f1.8. It creates amazing looking photos. It's a 35mm f1.8, so 35mm being that pretty much perfect middle ground, like not super wide but also not super telephoto lens. It gives you a really natural looking field of view, and personally 35mm is my absolute favorite focal length. This lens does struggle a little bit with chromatic aberrations, especially wide open, but once you stop down to f2.8 or f4, you're gonna get absolutely tack sharp, really low chromatic aberration, just really pristine looking images. It also has just a small bit of vignetting wide open, but once you stop down to f2 or f2.8, that'll go away as well. It's made out of metal, it feels really good quality in the hand. It has a 55mm filter thread. It actually has this manual aperture ring, which is really unique as well. Now the only issue I have with this lens is you really can't get super close to your subject. Now I'm not really asking for like macro level type of stuff, but you just can never really get as close as you'd expect to or really think you can. Without it just losing focus, not being able to focus any closer. But besides that, there's really nothing super special about this lens. It's a newer lens, it's tack sharp, and it doesn't really have any interesting characteristics like the Helios lens. However, if you're just looking for a 35mm lens that's really fast at f1.8, that has tack sharp optics and has really fast autofocus, then this is pretty much the lens for you, and it comes in at less than $400. Alright, last up on the list is this right here. This is a Canon FD 70 to 210mm f f4. Now this is another unique vintage lens. So again, just like the Helios, this doesn't have autofocus. This has no electronic contacts, no automatic aperture, anything like that. This is a fully manual vintage lens from, I believe, the 1980s. So this is that 70 to 210 millimeter, more portrait telephoto focal length for if you need to take pictures of wildlife, birds, you know, just other stuff from far away, or portraits or anything like that. This will give you a really good depth of field and really separate your subject from the background. Now this lens you can also pick up for well under $100, which is absolutely crazy because, you know, a Sony 70 to 200 millimeter lens with autofocus is gonna be like over $1,000. So being able to pick this up from like $60 to $100 is honestly mind-blowing for, you know, how sharp it is and how good it is wide open. And it also even has a special macro feature. So if you're zoomed all the way out to 70 millimeters and you spin it past the closest focal distance, you can see this little macro marking, and you can actually go into this macro mode and get super close-up images on your subjects. Now this lens is surprisingly sharp wide open at f4. That is pretty much what I use it at. You know, sometimes I'll stop down to f5.6 if I need to, and it has some of those unique vintage look characteristics, but overall this is a really clean lens and it gives you really good looking images. You know, just looking at footage taken with this lens, you kind of get those vintage characteristics, but at the same time, you don't specifically just instantly know it's a vintage lens, which is really good for a lot of people that are just looking for this longer focal length lens, like a 70 to 200 millimeter, but they don't want to spend $1,000 on a Sony one. Just 100% keep in mind that this does not have autofocus, and manual focusing at this focal length is a little difficult. It's definitely a lot more difficult than at wider focal lengths. So if you practice a lot and if you're talented at manual focusing, this is an amazing lens for well under $100, but just make sure you're used to manual focusing before trying this out, and same thing with the Helios. But there we go, that is it for these 3 must-have lenses for your Sony E-mount camera. If you enjoyed this video, please go down and hit the like button and subscribe. It'll really help out my channel, as well as check out some other videos I have on this channel. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.